The Duke of Ashford was a man who never smiled, never loved, and certainly never expected to find an infant wrapped in rags at his iron gate on a night when thunder shook the very foundations of London. But there she was, Miss Hannah Blythe, soaked to the bone and clutching a child that wasn't hers, her green eyes blazing with a fire that would melt the ice around his heart. He didn't know this desperate nurse would turn his world upside down. He didn't know the scandal that would follow would force them together in ways society never intended. He didn't know that saving one abandoned child would cost him everything he thought he wanted and give him everything he never knew he needed. But as he opened that gate on that stormy February night in 1823, one question burned through the darkness. Could a woman with nothing but courage and a borrowed baby teach the coldest man in England what it truly meant to live? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain fell in sheets across Mayfair, turning the cobblestones into rivers of mud. Duke Edward Cavendish stood at the window of his study, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand, watching the storm with detached interest. At 32 years of age, he had perfected the art of feeling nothing. His father had died when Edward was 15, leaving him a dukedom, 3 estates, and a fortune of nearly £200,000 a year. His mother followed within a year. Edward had learned then that love was a weakness, and the only safe path was one walked alone. The knocker on the front door sounded, barely audible over the storm. Edward frowned. It was past 11 o'clock, far too late for visitors. The knocker sounded again, more urgently, followed by a woman's voice calling out. Pemberton appeared at his study door. "Your Grace, there is a woman at the gate, with a child. She insists she must speak with you. She says a life depends upon it." Edward felt a flicker of irritation, but nodded. "Very well. I shall see what this is about." He followed Pemberton through the halls. The sound of the storm grew louder, and with it, the unmistakable wail of an infant. At the gate stood a figure in a sodden cloak, clutching a bundle to her chest. Edward grabbed an umbrella and stepped into the storm. As they reached the gate, the woman looked up, and Edward found himself staring into eyes of the most extraordinary green, like jade, wide with fear, but blazing with determination. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair plastered to her face. Her cloak was torn, and beneath it, the simple dress of a working woman. The bundle she held was a baby, wrapped in someone's petticoat and wailing. "Please," the woman gasped. "Please, Your Grace, you must help. This child has nowhere to go. Her mother died this evening. There is no family. The parish will take her to the Foundling Hospital, and you know what that means." Edward did know. The Foundling hospitals were death sentences delivered slowly. "That is unfortunate, but it is not my concern. This baby's name is Grace. Her mother's last words were a prayer that someone would give her child a chance. I have walked across half of London tonight, knocked on 20 doors. You are my last hope. Then your hope is misplaced. I am not equipped to care for an infant. You have money, servants, space, resources. All I am asking is that you do not let her die in some workhouse." The baby's wails intensified. Edward looked at the tiny face, red with crying, and felt something crack in his chest. Pemberton opened the gate. Hannah stumbled through, barely able to stand. Edward caught her arm, steadying her. "Come inside." They made their way back to the house. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, took one look and sprang into action. "Pemberton, fetch towels. Sarah, tell cook to heat milk. You girl, come with me." Hannah stood her ground. "I will not leave the child. No one is asking you to. We need to get you warm and dry. Your Grace, perhaps you might wait in the drawing room." Edward nodded and retreated to the drawing room. What had he done? He was a bachelor who lived alone by choice. Society would be scandalized. But he could not shake the image of that tiny face or the look in Hannah's eyes. Nearly an hour passed before Mrs. Hartwell returned. "The child is settled, fed and warm. Miss Blythe is in the small parlour." Edward found Hannah by the fire, dressed in a borrowed dress, her dark hair damp around her shoulders. She rose as he entered. "Sit, Miss Blythe. You have had quite an ordeal." "Thank you, Your Grace. I know I have placed you in a difficult position. Do you have any idea what you are asking of me? If I take this child in, society will tear me apart. They will assume she is mine. Forgive me, Your Grace, but perhaps a little scandal would make you seem more human." She leaned forward. "I am not asking you to keep her forever. Just give her a chance. Let me stay and care for her, Find her a good family. You need not even see her if you prefer. And what of you, Miss Blythe? You have risked much tonight." A shadow crossed Hannah's face. "I lost my position at the hospital, and I lost my own family to cholera 3 years ago. My parents, my younger brother. Tonight, when Grace's mother died in my arms, I knew I could not hand that child over to the Foundling Hospital. I just could not." Tears slid down her cheeks, and in that moment, Edward made a decision. "Very well, the child may stay, and you as well, for as long as necessary." Hannah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Truly? You mean it?" "I am not in the habit of saying things I do not mean," Edward replied, standing. "However, there will be conditions. First, this arrangement is temporary. You will seek a permanent placement for the child with all due haste. Second, you will handle all matters related to her care. I will not be a nursemaid. Third, discretion is paramount. We will tell no one where the child came from or the circumstances of her arrival. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Grace, absolutely." Hannah was on her feet now, her face transformed by a smile so radiant that Edward felt momentarily dazed by it. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means." "I suspect I will learn," Edward said dryly. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you to a room. We will discuss the practical arrangements in the morning." He left the parlor before Hannah could say anything more, his heart beating faster than it had in years. What had he done? In the space of an hour, he had gone from a man who lived alone and liked it that way, to a man harboring an infant of dubious origins and a nurse who spoke to him as if his title meant nothing. It was madness. It was chaos. And yet, as he climbed the stairs to his own chambers, Edward felt something he had not felt in years, the faintest stirring of something that might, in time, become hope. The first hints of dawn were breaking over London when Edward finally fell into an uneasy sleep, and his dreams were full of green eyes and the sound of a baby's cry, echoing through empty halls that had been silent for far too long. The morning brought fresh challenges. Edward woke to voices in the hallway, Mrs. Hartwell and Hannah in a heated discussion, punctuated by Grace's wails. He opened his door to find them mid-argument. "I am telling you, she needs to be near the kitchen," Hannah was saying. "The nursery is too cold and isolated." "The nursery has been the proper place for children in this household for 100 years, Mrs. Hartwell replied. "Good morning," Edward said. "Perhaps one of you might explain this discussion." They both turned. Hannah shifted Grace to her other hip. "Your housekeeper seems more concerned with tradition than with the welfare of a 3-month-old baby. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Blythe?" "The room next to the kitchen. Small but warm, with everything close at hand." Edward considered. "We will compromise. Miss Blythe, you may have the room, but I want it properly furnished. Mrs. Hartwell, see to it. And in future, disputes will be brought to me before they escalate. Is that clear?" The day proceeded with small disasters. A dropped tray, servants distracted by the baby's cries. Edward escaped to his study, determined to focus on estate business. A knock sounded. Hannah entered, Grace in her arms. "I wanted to thank you properly." "That is not necessary. You thanked me several times. I wanted you to understand what it means. Grace has a real chance now. Because of you." "Because of you," Edward corrected. "I merely provided shelter." Hannah's voice was soft. "Most men in your position would have turned us away. That speaks to character." Edward looked away, uncomfortable. "If you will excuse me, I have work." "Of course. May I ask you something? You seem to make a habit of it. Why did you agree? What changed your mind?" Edward was silent. "Perhaps I was simply tired of saying no." Hannah nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied her. "Well, I am very glad that you did. We will not be a burden on you for long, I promise. I have already begun making inquiries about suitable families." After she left, Edward sat staring at the closed door, her words echoing in his mind. The thought of Hannah and Grace leaving, of his house returning to its previous quiet order, should have brought relief. Instead, he felt a strange sense of emptiness, as if something that had just arrived was already preparing to depart, leaving him alone once more. He shook his head, annoyed at his own sentimentality, and turned his attention back to his work. But concentration proved elusive, broken repeatedly by sounds from elsewhere in the house. Hannah's voice singing softly, Grace's occasional cries, the bustle of servants adapting to their new situation. His ordered world, it seemed, was well and truly disrupted. The rest of the day passed in a blur of mundane tasks, interrupted by moments of chaos. Edward met with his man of business, Mr. Thornton, who raised his eyebrows but said nothing about the baby sounds occasionally audible from downstairs. He reviewed accounts from his Yorkshire estate, approved repairs to tenant cottages, and wrote a strongly worded letter to his steward in Devonshire about crop rotations. Normal ducal business, the kind that kept his vast holdings running smoothly and his tenants fed and housed. As evening approached, Edward found himself drawn downstairs, telling himself he was simply checking on how the household was adjusting to the new situation. He certainly was not hoping to catch another glimpse of Hannah Blythe. That would be absurd. He found her in the kitchen, of all places, working alongside cook to prepare Grace's evening feeding. The scene was so domestic, so at odds with the usual formality of his household, that Edward paused in the doorway, unseen, just watching. "A bit more milk, I think," Hannah was saying, testing the temperature of a bottle against her wrist. "She is a hungry one, this little miss. Never seen a baby housed in such a place," cook said, but her voice was fond rather than critical. "Still, I suppose it makes sense, having her close where it is warm. My own little ones always did better in the warmth. You have children, Mrs. Peterson?" Hannah asked, her face lighting with interest. "4, all grown now and making their own way. 2 boys in the Navy, 1 girl married to a baker in Southwark, and my youngest, Molly. She is in service up north." Cook's face softened with maternal pride. "I miss having little ones about, truth be told." "This one?" She nodded toward the cradle visible through the open door to Hannah's new room. "She reminds me of my Molly at that age, same color hair." Edward retreated before they could notice him, feeling oddly like an intruder in his own home. But as he climbed the stairs to dress for dinner, he found himself thinking about what Cook had said. She missed having children around. His house, vast and beautiful and perfectly maintained, had not heard a child's laughter in decades. His own childhood here had been solitary, formal, a parade of tutors and expectations with little room for joy. Was that what he had recreated as an adult? A beautiful prison where everything was perfect and nothing was alive. Dinner was served in the usual splendor, course after impeccable course presented on finest china and served by footmen in full livery. Edward ate alone at one end of a table that could seat 20, as he did every night, with only his thoughts for company. The food was excellent, the service was flawless, and he had never felt more alone in his life. Afterward he retreated to the library with a book, but the words swam before his eyes, meaningless. He found himself listening instead to the sounds of the house settling for the night, the quiet murmur of servants finishing their tasks, the distant cry of Grace and Hannah's soft voice soothing her. Finally, unable to concentrate, he set the book aside and went to his chambers, where his valet, Morrison, helped him prepare for bed with the same efficient silence he had maintained for a decade. Edward lay awake in the darkness, staring at the canopy of his bed, and wondered when his life had become so empty that a single day with a baby and a nurse in residence could make it feel almost full. It was a disturbing thought, one that kept him awake long into the night, listening to the old house creak and settle around him, no longer quite so quiet, no longer quite so cold, and no longer quite so completely his own. The next morning brought visitors, the thing Edward had been dreading. Lady Pemberton, a notorious gossip and the wife of a prominent earl, arrived at precisely 11 o'clock with her daughter, Miss Arabella Pemberton, a vapid creature of 18 who had been dangled before Edward for the past 2 seasons as potential Duchess material. Edward received them in the formal drawing room, with all the enthusiasm of a man facing a firing squad. Lady Pemberton, a handsome woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, settled herself on the sofa with the air of someone preparing for a long visit. "Your Grace, how delightful to see you," she began, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We were passing by and simply had to stop. Arabella has been so hoping to speak with you about the charity ball next month." "I am honored," Edward lied smoothly, nodding to Arabella, who simpered and blushed on cue. "Though I fear I have been too occupied with estate business to give much thought to social events." "Oh, but you simply must attend," Arabella breathed, her voice high and childlike. "It would not be the same without you, Your Grace." Edward was forming a polite refusal when disaster struck. From somewhere below, clear as a bell, came the unmistakable wail of an infant. Lady Pemberton's head swiveled toward the sound like a hawk spotting prey, her eyes widening with shock and delight. "Why, Your Grace," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "is that a baby I hear?" "You must be mistaken," Edward said coolly. But even as he spoke, the wailing intensified, joined now by Hannah's voice, clearly audible through the floorboards as she tried to soothe the child. "I am quite certain that is a baby," Lady Pemberton insisted, rising from her seat. "In fact, I am sure of it. Your Grace, have you taken in a child?" Before Edward could respond, the drawing-room door opened and Hannah appeared, her face flushed and apologetic, carrying a red-faced and screaming, "Grace! Your Grace, I am so sorry to interrupt, but I need—" "Oh." She stopped dead, suddenly aware of the visitors, and her face went white. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Grace's cries. Lady Pemberton stared at Hannah, then at the baby, then at Edward, her expression cycling through shock, disapproval, and finally settling on malicious glee. This was gossip gold, and they all knew it. "I see," Lady Pemberton said slowly. "How? Interesting. Your Grace, I was not aware you had, that is to say, I had not heard." "What you have not heard, Lady Pemberton," Edward said, his voice cutting through her, stammering with Arctic precision, "is any of your concern. Miss Blythe is a nurse whom I have employed to care for an orphaned child, temporarily residing under my protection. The child's mother died, leaving no family or means of support. Rather than see an innocent infant condemned to the foundling hospital, I chose to provide temporary shelter until a permanent situation can be arranged. I trust that even the most determined gossip would struggle to find scandal in an act of Christian charity." The speech was masterful, delivered with such cold authority that even Lady Pemberton seemed momentarily cowed. But Edward could see the calculations behind her eyes, the ways this story would be twisted and embellished as it made its rounds through London society. Orphan child, young nurse, bachelor duke. The assumptions would fly regardless of his explanation. "Of course, Your Grace," Lady Pemberton said, recovering her composure. "How very charitable of you. Though one might wonder at the propriety of a young, unmarried woman residing in a bachelor establishment, even in such noble circumstances. One might also wonder at the propriety of a woman questioning the arrangements made within a duke's own household," Edward replied, his tone leaving no doubt that this conversation was over. "Now, if you will excuse me, I believe Miss Blythe requires my assistance. Pemberton will see you out." He stood, effectively ending the visit, and watched with grim satisfaction as Lady Pemberton gathered her daughter and swept from the room, her back rigid with offended dignity. The moment the door closed behind them, Edward turned to Hannah, who was still standing frozen with Grace in her arms. "I am so sorry," Hannah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was inconsolable, and I did not know you had visitors, and I—" "Peace, Miss Blythe," Edward said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "It is not your fault, and in truth, it was bound to happen sooner or later. London society has a way of ferreting out anything interesting, and a baby in the home of the Ice Duke certainly qualifies." "The Ice Duke?" Hannah repeated, a hint of a smile breaking through her distress. "Apparently that is what they call me," Edward admitted, among other, less flattering appellations. "Come, let us retire to my study. We need to discuss how to manage this situation before the gossip becomes uncontrollable." In the study, with Grace finally settling in Hannah's arms, they sat across from each other like generals planning a battle. Edward had dealt with social challenges before, but never one quite like this. The presence of a baby and a young woman in his household was a powder keg waiting to explode. "We need to control the narrative," he said, pacing before the fireplace. "If we allow Lady Pemberton to define the story, it will destroy both our reputations, yours for impropriety, mine for taking advantage or worse." "What do you propose?" Hannah asked, gently rocking Grace. "The truth, or a version of it? We say exactly what I told Lady Pemberton, that you brought the child to me seeking help, and I agreed to provide temporary shelter while you sought a permanent placement. We emphasize the temporary nature of the arrangement, your role as a paid nurse rather than a—" He paused, searching for a delicate way to phrase it. "Rather than a mistress," Hannah finished bluntly, and Edward felt heat rise to his face. Quite. We also need to establish propriety. Mrs. Hartwell will serve as chaperone. You will take your meals with the staff, not with me. We minimize any appearance of familiarity or intimacy. And you redouble your efforts to find the child a permanent home. The sooner this situation is resolved, the better. Hannah nodded slowly, but something in her expression had shuttered. The warmth he had glimpsed earlier replaced by cool professionalism. I understand, Your Grace. You wish me to remember my place. That is not what Edward began, then stopped. Was it not? Was he not trying to push her back into the safe category of servant, someone he need not think about or feel complicated things toward? I am trying to protect us both, he finished lamely. Of course, Your Grace, Hannah said, rising with grace. With your permission, I will return to my duties. I would not wish to give anyone further cause for gossip. She left before he could respond, and Edward sank into his chair with a sigh. He had handled that poorly, but he did not know how else to manage it. The truth was, Hannah Blythe unsettled him in ways he did not care to examine. She was bold, passionate, completely unsuited to his ordered life, and yet he found himself thinking about her at odd moments, remembering the fire in her eyes, the tenderness with which she held Grace, the way she had stood in the rain and demanded that he be better than he was. It was dangerous. It was foolish, and he needed to stop it before it went any further. But that night, as he lay in bed once again sleepless, Edward found his resolution wavering. The house felt different now, warmer somehow despite the February cold. There was life in these old walls, purpose beyond the mere maintenance of property and position. And despite all his logical reasons for keeping his distance, he could not quite bring himself to regret the moment he had opened that gate and let Hannah and Grace into his life. The week that followed was a study in contrasts and contradictions that would have fascinated Edward if he were not living through it. By day he maintained his usual routine, managing his estates, attending sessions at the House of Lords, conducting business with his various stewards and agents. He was the picture of ducal dignity, cold, efficient, utterly in control. But his evenings, which had once been spent in solitary reading or correspondence, now held a strange tension. He found himself lingering in hallways, walking past the kitchen more often than necessary, making excuses to speak with Mrs. Hartwell about household matters that did not require his attention. Always, he was aware of Hannah's presence in his home, the sound of her voice singing to Grace, her quick footsteps on the stairs, her laughter when one of the servants said something amusing. The scandal, as predicted, spread through London like wildfire. Within 3 days, everyone who mattered knew that the Duke of Ashford had taken in an orphaned baby and a pretty young nurse. The assumptions were immediate and uncharitable. Some whispered that the child was his bastard. Others suggested Hannah was his mistress. A few particularly creative gossips combined both theories, creating elaborate stories about secret affairs and abandoned love children. Edward ignored it all with the same icy disdain he had cultivated for years, but he could see the toll it took on Hannah. She grew quieter, more withdrawn, taking pains to avoid him, even when circumstances brought them into the same room. The easy boldness she had shown that first night was gone, replaced by a careful propriety that felt like a wall between them. It should have made things easier. Instead, it made Edward inexplicably angry. The breaking point came 8 days after Grace's arrival, at a musicale hosted by the Duchess of Marlborough. Edward attended out of obligation, enduring the usual parade of hopeful mothers with marriageable daughters and the barely concealed curiosity about his household situation. He was preparing to make his excuses and leave when a voice cut through the crowd, loud enough to carry. Of course the child must be his. Why else would a man like Ashford suddenly acquire maternal instincts? The speaker was Lord Wickham, a dissolute peer with a reputation for cruelty and a fondness for spreading malicious gossip. And the nurse, well, we all know what that means. Convenient, is it not? A mistress who comes with the excuse of caring for his byblow. Edward turned slowly, his expression so cold that nearby conversations faltered and died. Lord Wickham, emboldened by wine and the attention of his audience, failed to notice the danger until Edward was standing directly in front of him. "You will," Edward said softly, each word precisely enunciated. "Repeat what you just said, slowly." And then you will explain to me why I should not call you out for slandering a woman who has done nothing more than show compassion to a helpless child." The room had gone utterly silent. Lord Wickham's face cycled through shades of red and white as he realized his error. One did not insult the Duke of Ashford, not if one valued one's place in society or, in the case of a potential duel, one's life. I meant no offence, Your Grace," Wickham stammered. "I was merely repeating what others have said." "Then others are fools, and you are a greater fool for giving their gossip voice." Edward's voice was still quiet, but it carried through the room like a whip crack. "Miss Blythe is a woman of impeccable character, who acted out of pure compassion. The child under my protection is an orphan with no connection to me beyond my choice to offer her temporary shelter. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Grace, perfectly clear," Wickham said, backing away. "I apologize profusely for any misunderstanding." Edward held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and surveyed the room. Every eye was upon him, some shocked, some calculating, all intensely interested. He had just committed himself publicly to Hannah's defense, tied his reputation to hers in a way that society would not forget. "That goes for everyone," he said, his voice carrying to every corner. "Miss Blythe and the child Grace are under my protection. Anyone who wishes to malign them will have me to deal with. Now, I believe I have had quite enough entertainment for one evening. Good night." He left the musicale to a buzz of excited whispers that would fuel gossip for days to come. But Edward found he did not care. Something had crystallized in that moment. A realization that he was tired of living in fear of what society thought, tired of keeping everyone at arm's length, tired of being alone in a house full of empty rooms. When he arrived home, it was past midnight, but light still glowed from under the door to Hannah's room. Edward found himself moving toward it before he could think better of it, drawn by an impulse he did not fully understand. He knocked softly, and after a moment, the door opened. Hannah stood there in her nightgown and a borrowed robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, Grace sleeping against her shoulder. She looked tired, beautiful, and surprised to see him. "Your Grace? Is something wrong? May I come in?" Edward asked, and at her nod, he entered the small room that had become her world. It was simply furnished but cheerful, with flowers someone had brought from the hothouse and small touches that made it feel like a home rather than just a place to sleep. Grace's cradle stood near the bed, and the walls were covered with drawings that one of the maids must have done. "I wanted to tell you," Edward began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "There was an incident tonight. Someone spoke disparagingly about you and Grace. I addressed it." Hannah's eyes widened. "What did you say? That you were under my protection, both of you, and that anyone who maligned you would answer to me?" He met her gaze steadily. "I wanted you to know that I will not allow society to destroy your reputation because of my choice to help. You were right that first night. I have the power to protect you, and I intend to use it." For a long moment, Hannah was silent, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something. Then, softly, she said, "Why? Why what? Why do you care what they say about me? I am just a nurse, Your Grace. My reputation is not your responsibility." "Is it not?" Edward took a step closer, drawn by something he could no longer name or resist. "You came to my gate seeking help for a child who was not yours. You risked everything because you could not bear to see an innocent suffer. Do you not see that such courage, such compassion, deserves protection? Or perhaps," Hannah said slowly, "you are simply tired of being the Ice Duke, alone in his castle, and we gave you an excuse to feel something again." The words hit Edward like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He stared at Hannah, at this woman who seemed to see through all his carefully constructed defenses to the lonely man beneath, and felt something in him break open, like ice cracking in spring. "Perhaps," he admitted, his voice rough, "perhaps I am tired of being cold. Perhaps walking through my empty house every day has become unbearable. Perhaps," he paused, struggling with words he had never said aloud, "perhaps I am tired of living half a life, going through motions, pretending that I do not want more than this." Hannah shifted Grace to her other shoulder, her eyes never leaving his face. "And what do you want, Your Grace?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities and dangers. Edward knew he should step back, should retreat to his safe distance and his proper formality. But he was so tired of safe. so tired of proper. "I want to feel alive again," he said quietly. "I want to walk through my house and hear laughter. I want to care about something more than account books and crop rotations. I want," he hesitated, then finished in a near whisper, "I want to not be alone anymore." Tears shimmered in Hannah's eyes. "Then stop pushing us away," she said. "Stop treating me like a servant you must avoid. Stop acting as if caring about Grace, about us, is a weakness to be conquered. You opened your gate that night, Your Grace. Now open your heart." The words were a challenge and an invitation all at once. Edward took another step forward, close enough now that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could smell the lavender soap she used, could hear the soft sound of her breathing. For one breathless moment, he thought he might do something irrevocable, something that would change everything. Instead, he reached out and gently touched Grace's soft hair, feeling the baby stir and sigh in her sleep. "She is so small," he murmured, "so fragile. I had forgotten that life could be this delicate." "All life is delicate," Hannah said softly. "Even yours, even mine. We are all just doing our best to survive, to find meaning, to connect with others before our time runs out. You have been surviving for so long, Your Grace. Perhaps it is time to start living." Edward looked up from the sleeping baby to meet Hannah's eyes, and in them he saw an invitation, not to anything improper, but to something far more dangerous. A chance at real connection, at genuine feeling, at stepping out from behind the walls he had built, and letting someone truly see him. "I do not know if I remember how," he admitted. "Then I will teach you," Hannah said, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. "Starting tomorrow. But for now, Your Grace, it is late, and Grace will wake early. We all need our rest." It was a dismissal, gentle but firm, and Edward accepted it with good grace. As he turned to leave, Hannah's voice stopped him at the door. "Your Grace, what you did tonight defending me, it meant more than I can say." "Thank you, Edward," he said impulsively, turning back. "When we are alone, please call me Edward." Hannah's smile widened. "Then good night, Edward. Sleep well." Edward made his way to his own chambers in a daze, his name on her lips echoing in his ears. Morrison helped him prepare for bed with his usual efficiency, and if the valet noticed his master's distracted state, he was too well trained to comment. Finally alone, Edward lay in the darkness and thought about what had just happened. The confession he had made, the wall he had allowed to crack. He should be afraid. He should be planning how to rebuild his defenses. Instead, he felt something else entirely, a strange, unfamiliar lightness, as if a weight he had not known he was carrying had been partially lifted. For the first time in years, Edward went to sleep not with plans for the next day's business, but with anticipation of what the morning might bring, and the knowledge that somewhere in his house, a woman with green eyes and a borrowed baby was sleeping, and when she woke, she would teach him how to live again. The next morning dawned clear and bright, winter sun streaming through windows that suddenly seemed less imposing and more welcoming. Edward woke with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with estate business, and everything to do with a conversation in a small room off the kitchen. He dressed with more care than usual, ignoring Morrison's carefully hidden surprise, and made his way downstairs with something that might have been eagerness in his step. He found Hannah in the morning room, a space he had rarely used, sitting by the window with Grace in her arms and a cup of tea at her elbow. Sunlight caught in her dark hair, turning its shades of chestnut and copper, and she was humming softly, a melody Edward did not recognize but found himself wanting to learn. "Good morning," he said from the doorway, and she looked up with a smile that did strange things to his heart. "Good morning, Edward," she said his name naturally, as if she had been using it for years rather than hours. "We did not expect you so early. Grace and I were just enjoying the sunshine. May I join you?" he asked, still hovering at the threshold like a guest in his own home. "Please," Hannah said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Though I warn you, Grace is in a playful mood this morning. She may demand your attention." Edward settled into the chair and found himself under the solemn scrutiny of two pairs of eyes, one green and knowing, the other blue and innocent. Grace stared at him with the intense focus only babies possess, as if trying to determine what manner of creature he was. "Hello, Grace," he said awkwardly, unsure of the proper way to address an infant. To his surprise, Grace's serious expression broke into a toothless grin, and she waved her small fists in what appeared to be approval. Hannah laughed, a sound of such pure delight that Edward felt something in his chest expand. "She likes you," Hannah said. "That is a good sign. Babies are excellent judges of character." "Are they?" Edward asked, unable to look away from that tiny, smiling face. "Oh yes. They see past all our careful masks, straight to the truth beneath. Grace knows you are a good man, even if you have spent years trying to convince everyone otherwise." Before Edward could respond to that, Grace let out an imperious squeal and reached toward him with grasping hands. Hannah laughed again. "I think she wants you to hold her. Would you like to?" "I have never held a baby," Edward admitted. "I would not want to drop her or hold her incorrectly." "You will not drop her. Here, like this." Hannah rose and came to stand beside him, and before Edward could protest, she was settling Grace into his arms, adjusting his grip, showing him how to support the baby's head. Her hands were warm on his, her face close enough that he could see the tiny freckles scattered across her nose, and for a moment, Edward forgot to breathe. Then Grace wiggled, reclaiming his attention, and he looked down at the small weight in his arms with something approaching wonder. She was so light, so completely trusting, her tiny fingers wrapping around one of his in a grip that felt surprisingly strong. "There," Hannah said softly, stepping back. "You are a natural." Edward did not feel natural. He felt terrified and awed, and absurdly proud that this small creature seemed content in his hold. "What do I do now?" he asked. "Just hold her. Talk to her if you like. She enjoys the sound of voices." Hannah returned to her chair, watching them with an expression Edward could not quite read. "What should I say?" Edward asked helplessly. "Whatever you wish. Tell her about your day, your thoughts. Babies do not judge." Edward looked down at Grace, who was still clutching his finger and staring at him with those wide blue eyes. "Well then, Grace," he began hesitantly, "I suppose I should tell you about the house. This room, for instance, was my mother's favorite. She liked the morning light." The words came easier than he expected, as if something in Grace's accepting gaze gave him permission to speak. "She died when I was 16, I thought. I thought I would never recover from losing her, so I simply stopped feeling anything at all. Much easier that way." "Is it?" Hannah asked quietly. "Easier? I thought so," Edward admitted, still looking at Grace. "For years I thought I had found the perfect solution. Feel nothing, want nothing, risk nothing. But then a stubborn nurse appeared at my gate in a storm with a baby in her arms, and suddenly my perfect solution no longer worked." "I am sorry," Hannah said, though she did not sound sorry at all. "I am not," Edward said, surprising himself with the truth of it. He looked up to meet Hannah's eyes. Uncomfortable, yes. Confused, certainly. But not sorry. They sat in companionable silence for a while, Grace eventually growing drowsy in Edward's arms, her eyes fluttering closed as she drifted off to sleep. Hannah showed him how to place her in the small basket she used during the day, and Edward marveled at how such a tiny person could feel so heavy when sleeping. "She trusts you," Hannah observed as they watched the baby sleep. "That is a rare gift, Edward." "I do not deserve it," he said. "None of us deserve the gifts we are given. We simply accept them with grace and do our best to be worthy of them." Hannah paused, then added, "I have been making inquiries, as promised, about a permanent situation for Grace." Edward felt his chest tighten. "Have you found anything?" "There is a couple, the Hendersons. He is a solicitor with a modest but comfortable income. They lost their own child last year and have been seeking to adopt. They seem kind, financially stable, able to provide the sort of life Grace deserves." "That sounds ideal," Edward managed, though the word tasted like ash in his mouth. "Yes," Hannah agreed, but she did not sound happy about it. "They wish to meet her next week. If all goes well, she could be placed with them within a fortnight. 2 weeks. And then Grace would be gone, and shortly after, Hannah would follow, having fulfilled her mission. Edward's life would return to its previous order, his house to its accustomed silence. Everything would be as it was, except it would not, because he would remember. He would remember this moment, the weight of a sleeping baby in his arms, the warmth of sunlight, and the sound of Hannah's voice teaching him how to live. He would remember, and the memory would haunt every empty room. "Of course," Edward said, keeping his voice carefully neutral, "that is for the best." Grace deserves a proper family. Yes, Hannah said again, and this time there was no mistaking the sadness in her voice. She does. The week that followed was bittersweet in ways Edward had not anticipated. Now that the end was in sight, he found himself wanting to grasp at every moment, to stretch time like taffy and hold it fast. He began taking his breakfast in the morning room with Hannah and Grace, abandoning the formal dining room for the first time in years. He made excuses to stop by during the day, checking on trivial household matters that could easily have been handled by Pemberton or Mrs. Hartwell. And every evening, after the household had retired, he found himself drawn to Hannah's room, where they would sit and talk while Grace slept, conversations that ranged from the profound to the absurd about everything and nothing, building between them a fragile connection that felt more real than anything Edward had known in years. "Tell me about your family," he asked one evening, watching the firelight play across Hannah's face. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "My father was a schoolteacher," she said finally. "Not wealthy, but educated, passionate about learning. He taught me to read before I was 4, to think critically, to question everything. My mother was a vicar's daughter, practical and kind, with a gift for healing. She taught me about herbs, about nursing, about caring for those who suffer. And my brother, Thomas," her voice caught. "He was 10 years younger than me, a surprise late in their lives. He was brilliant, sweet, so full of promise." "What happened?" Edward asked gently. "Cholera, 3 years ago. It swept through our neighborhood in Clerkenwell. My father fell ill first, then Thomas, then my mother as she nursed them. I tried everything I knew, but it was not enough. Within a week, they were all gone, and I was alone." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That is when I became a nurse. I could not save my own family, but I thought perhaps I could save someone else's." Edward reached across the space between them and took her hand, an intimacy that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. "I am so sorry, Hannah. We all carry losses," she said, her fingers tightening on his. "Yours are different but no less real. At least I had love, even if it was taken from me too soon. You have spent years denying yourself even the possibility of it." "I was afraid," Edward admitted. "After my mother died, the pain was so overwhelming that I thought it would destroy me. So I built walls, told myself I would never care that deeply again." "And how has that worked for you?" Hannah asked with a sad smile. "Poorly," Edward said with a huff of laughter. "Very poorly indeed. I have been a coward, Hannah. I see that now. I thought I was being strong, but I was simply hiding." "Then stop hiding," Hannah said, leaning forward. "You said you wanted to feel alive again. This is how, Edward. You open yourself to joy, and yes, you risk pain. But a life without risk is not really life at all." Her face was close to his, close enough that he could feel her breath on his skin, close enough that one small movement would bring their lips together. Edward felt frozen, caught between desire and fear, wanting her with an intensity that shocked him and terrified of what that wanting meant. In the end, it was Hannah who closed the distance, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle, tentative, and utterly transformative. Edward felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble, felt years of ice melting away in the warmth of her touch, and for the first time since he was a boy, he allowed himself to simply feel. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Hannah's eyes were wide and wondering. "I should not have done that," she whispered. "I am very glad you did," Edward replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Hannah, I do not know what this is between us, but I know I do not want it to end. Not in a fortnight, not ever." "Edward," she began, but he cut her off, words pouring out in a rush. "I know this is mad. I know we come from different worlds, that society will condemn us, that there are 1,000 reasons why this cannot work. But I find I do not care about any of it. You have shown me how empty my life was, how much I was missing by holding everyone at distance. Grace will go to the Hendersons, yes, because that is what is best for her. But you, Hannah, I am asking you to stay. Not as a nurse, not as an employee, but as—" He paused, barely able to believe what he was about to say. "As my wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Hannah stared at him, her face cycling through shock, joy, and then, heartbreakingly, sorrow. "Edward, I cannot or will not?" he asked, feeling hope crumble. Cannot. It would not be fair to you. You are a duke. You need a proper wife, someone from your world, someone who can move in society without causing scandal. I am a nurse, a woman with no family, no dowry, no position. If you married me, it would destroy your reputation." "I do not care about my reputation," Edward said fiercely. "Have I not made that clear? These past weeks with you and Grace have been the happiest of my life. I would trade 1,000 approving nods from society for one more morning watching you with Grace in the sunlight. But you would come to regret it," Hannah said, tears now streaming down her face. "When the scandal dies down and reality sets in, when you realize what you have sacrificed, you would grow to resent me. I could not bear that, Edward. I would rather walk away now with beautiful memories than stay and watch you learn to hate me." "I could never hate you," Edward said desperately. "You do not know that. Neither of us do." Hannah stood, putting distance between them. "Please, Edward, do not make this harder than it already is. In a fortnight, Grace will go to her new family, and I will find another position. We will part as friends, grateful for what we have shared." "I do not want to be your friend," Edward said, rising to face her. "I want to be your husband. I want to wake up every morning to your smile. I want to argue with you about household arrangements and listen to you sing off-key lullabies. I want to grow old with you, Hannah. Please, do not walk away from this, from us." For a moment, he thought he had reached her. Her face softened, her hand lifted as if to touch his cheek. But then she drew back, wrapping her arms around herself like a shield. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so, so sorry. But my answer is no." Edward felt something break inside him, sharper and more painful than anything he had felt when his parents died. This was not the dull ache of loss, but the acute agony of a future stolen away, of happiness glimpsed and then snatched back. He nodded stiffly, unable to trust his voice, and left her room without another word. He spent the next week in a haze of misery, throwing himself into work with a desperate intensity that fooled no one. Pemberton watched him with worried eyes. Mrs. Hartwell fussed and left his favorite foods untouched on the dinner table. Even his man of business commented that his Grace seemed distracted. But it was nothing compared to watching Hannah. She moved through the house like a ghost, pale and quiet, avoiding him whenever possible. When they did encounter each other, she was unfailingly polite and utterly distant, as if that kiss had never happened, as if he had never offered her his heart and she had never broken it. The day of the Hendersons' visit arrived with cruel inevitability. Edward made himself scarce, unable to bear watching Grace being evaluated like a horse at auction, but afterward he sought out Hannah to hear the news. "They loved her," Hannah said, her voice flat and lifeless. "They wish to proceed with the adoption. Mr. Henderson has already engaged a solicitor to draw up the papers. They will take her at the end of the week." "So soon," Edward said. "They want to take her home before she becomes too attached to this place." Too attached. Like he had become too attached to Grace, to the sound of her laughter, to the feeling of holding her in his arms. Like he had become too attached to Hannah, to everything she had brought into his cold and empty life. "And you?" he asked. "When will you go?" "I have secured a position with a family in Yorkshire. They need a nurse for their children. I leave the day after Grace goes to the Hendersons." She finally looked at him, her green eyes dull with grief. "It is better this way, Edward. A clean break." "There is nothing clean about this," Edward said bitterly. "We are both miserable. Grace will be raised by strangers. And for what? So that you can preserve my reputation? So that we can both be respectable and alone?" "Yes," Hannah said simply, "because in the end, Edward, love is not enough. It is not enough to overcome the differences between us, not enough to shield you from the consequences of such an unequal marriage." "I love you," her voice broke on the words. "God help me, I love you. But I love you enough to let you go." She turned and walked away, leaving Edward standing in the hallway with her words echoing in his ears. She loved him, and yet she was leaving anyway, convinced that her love was not enough, that he would come to regret choosing her. The irony would have been funny if it were not destroying him. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Mrs. Hartwell packed Grace's few belongings with gentle efficiency. Cook prepared special treats, as if feeding a baby could somehow make up for the loss. Even Pemberton, stoic Pemberton, was seen wiping his eyes when he thought no one was looking. On Grace's last night at Ashford House, Edward found himself once again at Hannah's door. She opened it with resignation, as if she had been expecting him. "I cannot let you leave without trying one more time," he said without preamble. "Hannah, please, reconsider. Marry me. Let us raise Grace together, make a family. Damn what society thinks." "We cannot keep Grace," Hannah said gently. "The Hendersons will give her the life she deserves. And as for us—" She paused, her composure cracking. "Edward, do you know what it would mean for you to marry so far beneath your station? You would be cut by society. Your peers would mock you. Any children we had would be tainted by the scandal." "I do not care," Edward said desperately. "None of that matters without you. It would matter eventually, and I cannot be the reason you are diminished, Edward. I cannot be the woman who destroyed the Duke of Ashford." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers trembling. "Please, let me do this one good thing. Let me walk away before I ruin you." Edward caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek. "You have already ruined me, Hannah. You ruined me the moment you appeared at my gate, with a baby in your arms and fire in your eyes. You ruined me for my old life, my old certainties. If you walk away now, I will be ruined anyway, only alone instead of with the woman I love." Hannah's face crumpled, and she pulled her hand away. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. But my answer remains no. Goodbye, Edward." This time, he let her close the door between them, let her shut him out. He stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the sound of her muffled sobs through the wood, his own tears finally falling unchecked. Tomorrow Grace would leave. The day after, Hannah would follow, and Edward would be alone once more in his silent house, with nothing but memories and regrets for company. He had thought, when he built his walls and locked his heart away, that he was protecting himself from pain. But it turned out that the greatest pain of all was not losing what you had, but losing what you had almost claimed, the future that had been so close he could taste it, only to watch it slip through his fingers because the woman he loved did not believe she was worthy of being chosen. That night, Edward made a decision. He would not let Hannah leave thinking she was not enough. He would not let her walk away believing her love was insufficient. Tomorrow, when Grace went to the Hendersons, he would make one final stand, not with arguments or logic, but with actions that could not be misunderstood. If Hannah still chose to leave after that, he would respect her decision, but she would leave knowing beyond doubt that she had been chosen, valued, loved. For the first time in days, Edward slept soundly, his mind clear with purpose. When morning came, he would do what he should have done from the beginning. He would choose love over fear, connection over propriety, and Hannah over everything else. And if society condemned him for it, well, he had spent 32 years being the man they expected. Perhaps it was time to be the man he wanted to be instead. The morning dawned grey and somber, matching the mood that hung over Ashford House like a shroud. The Hendersons were due at 10 o'clock, and by 9, the household was in a state of barely contained grief. Cook had made Grace's favourite gruel with extra care. Sarah had dressed her in the finest clothes the household could provide, a little white dress with pink ribbons that Mrs. Hartwell had stayed up late to finish. Even Thomas, the footman, had carved a small wooden rattle as a parting gift. Edward found Hannah in her room, holding Grace for what might be the last time, tears streaming silently down her face as she memorized every detail of the baby's face. He stood in the doorway, drinking in the sight of them, the woman he loved and the child who had brought them together, and felt his resolve harden to steel. "Hannah," he said quietly, and she looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Before the Hendersons arrive, I need you to come with me. There is something I must show you." "Edward, I cannot, Grace. Mrs. Hartwell will watch Grace for a few moments. Please, Hannah, this is important." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she nodded and gently placed Grace in the housekeeper's capable arms. Edward led her through the house to a part of the residence she had never seen, the family wing, where a generation of Cavendishes had lived their private lives away from the public rooms. He stopped before a door she had likely never noticed, unlocked it with a key he drew from his pocket, and gestured for her to enter. Hannah stepped inside and gasped. The room was a nursery, but not the cold, formal space on the third floor. This was warm and bright, painted in soft yellows and creams, with a beautiful hand-carved cradle in the center and toys arranged on low shelves. Sunlight poured through large windows that overlooked the gardens, and a rocking chair sat by the fireplace, perfectly positioned for reading bedtime stories or soothing a crying child. "I had this prepared last week," Edward said quietly, watching Hannah take in every detail. "My mother used this room for me when I was an infant. It has been locked and unused for 3 decades. I thought Grace might like it, and any other children who might come after." Hannah turned to him with wide eyes. "Edward, what are you saying?" "I am saying that I am not letting Grace go. I am saying that I am adopting her myself, if you will not marry me and help me raise her together." He moved into the room, standing in the center of his declaration. "I have already spoken with my solicitor. As a duke, I have the power to claim guardianship. The Hendersons are good people, but Grace belongs here, with us. And if you insist on leaving anyway, well, then I will raise her alone. But I will not send her away, Hannah. I cannot." "You would do that?" Hannah whispered. "You would take on the responsibility of raising a child, face all the scandal and gossip, just to keep her?" "I would do it for Grace, yes," Edward said, taking a step closer. "Because she has brought light into this house and taught me what it means to care for someone beyond myself. But mostly, Hannah, I would do it for you, because I know you love her, and I know that letting her go is breaking your heart. I cannot give you back your family, but I can give you this one, Grace and me, and whatever future we build together, if you will take the risk." Hannah was crying now, her hands pressed to her mouth, her whole body shaking with the force of her emotion. "You would give up everything, your reputation, your standing, just to keep us." "I am not giving up anything that matters," Edward said, finally closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. "What matters is you, Hannah. You and Grace and the life we could have if you would just believe that you are worthy of being chosen. I am not some martyr sacrificing myself on the altar of your unworthiness. I am a man who has finally found something worth having, worth fighting for, worth changing my entire life to keep. You said love is not enough. Maybe you were right, but love and courage together, love and determination, love and a willingness to be more than what society expects. That, Hannah, that is everything." For a long moment, she simply stared at him, searching his face for any trace of doubt or regret. Edward let her look. Let her see the truth written in his eyes, the absolute certainty that this was what he wanted, who he wanted, the only future he could imagine that had any meaning. "I am terrified," Hannah finally whispered. "So am I," Edward admitted. "But I would rather be terrified with you than safe and alone without you. If I say yes, everything will change. Your life, your world, it will never be the same." "Promise?" Edward asked with a smile, and was rewarded with a watery laugh. "You truly want this, me and Grace and all the chaos we bring? I want you exactly as you are, chaos and courage, and that infuriating habit of telling me uncomfortable truths. I want Grace laughing in the morning room and toys scattered across the library floor. I want a life that is messy and real and full of love, even if it means I am no longer the Ice Duke but simply Edward, a man who chose happiness over propriety. So yes, Hannah Blythe, I want this. I want you. I want us. Will you marry me?" Hannah closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, there was something new in her gaze. Not fear or doubt, but hope, bright and fierce, and strong enough to build a future on. "Yes," she said, and the word was barely more than a breath, but it was the most beautiful sound Edward had ever heard. "Yes, I will marry you." Edward pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he loosened his grip. She held him just as tightly, and they stood there in the nursery that would soon hold Grace, and perhaps, someday, other children, surrounded by sunlight and possibility. A knock at the door interrupted them. Pemberton appeared, his face carefully neutral. "Your Grace, the Hendersons have arrived." Edward looked down at Hannah, saw his own determination reflected in her eyes. "Tell them," he said clearly, "that there has been a change of plans. Grace will not be leaving Ashford House. She is home, and here she will stay." Pemberton's face broke into the first genuine smile Edward had seen from him in years. "Very good, Your Grace. I shall inform them. And may I say, if I may be so bold, that I believe this is a most excellent decision." After the butler left, Edward turned back to Hannah with a grin. "I suppose we should go tell Grace the news? I suppose we should tell Mrs. Hartwell that she is about to gain a duchess who has no idea how to run a household of this size," Hannah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "She will teach you," Edward said. and if not, we shall muddle through together. After all, I had no idea how to hold a baby a few weeks ago, and I managed to learn." They made their way back through the house hand in hand, ignoring the shocked and delighted faces of the staff as word of the engagement spread like wildfire. In Hannah's small room off the kitchen, Mrs. Hartwell was rocking Grace and humming, and she looked up with knowing eyes as they entered. "I take it the Hendersons will not be needed?" she asked with a smile. "Grace is staying," Edward said firmly, "and Hannah has agreed to marry me, so I suppose we shall need to prepare for a wedding." "About time," Mrs. Hartwell said tartly, rising and placing Grace in Hannah's arms. "I was beginning to think you would let stubbornness and propriety rob you both of happiness. Your mother would be pleased, Your Grace. This house has needed love and laughter for too long." As if in agreement, Grace let out a happy squeal and reached for Edward, who took her without hesitation, marveling at how natural it had become to hold this small person, how right it felt to have Hannah at his side and Grace in his arms. "What will we tell people?" Hannah asked, though she sounded less worried now, more curious. "About Grace, about us. The truth," Edward said, "or as much of it as they need to know. That Grace is an orphan we have chosen to raise as our own. That you came to me seeking help and stole my heart in the process. That I am choosing love over convention, and anyone who does not approve can keep their opinions to themselves." He looked down at Grace, then at Hannah, his family. Imperfect and unconventional, and absolutely perfect. "Let them gossip, Hannah. Let them stare and whisper and judge. We will be too busy being happy to care." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and transformation. Edward had his solicitor draw up adoption papers, officially making Grace Cavendish ward of the Duke of Ashford. The announcement caused exactly the scandal he had predicted, with society matrons clutching their pearls and gossip sheets working overtime to fabricate scandalous explanations. But Edward, true to his word, ignored it all. Instead, he focused on planning a wedding that would make Hannah happy, consulting her on every detail, from flowers to food to the guest list. When she protested that it was too much, that they could marry quietly, he was firm. "You deserve a wedding, Hannah, a real one, with all the beauty and ceremony that should mark the beginning of a life together. I will not have you married in some hurried, shameful ceremony, as if I am ashamed of choosing you. Let them all see how proud I am to make you my Duchess." The wedding took place on a bright morning in late March, in the chapel at Ashford House, with spring flowers everywhere and sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. Hannah wore a dress of ivory silk that Edward had commissioned, simple but elegant, and in her arms she carried Grace, who was part of the ceremony in a way that made several traditional guests gasp. The Archbishop, an old friend of Edward's father, performed the ceremony with good grace, though his eyebrows did rise at the sight of the baby. When he reached the part about impediments, a few guests shifted uncomfortably, but Edward simply smiled and said his vows clearly and firmly, claiming Hannah as his wife before God, and witnesses with pride in his voice. "I, Edward James Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, take thee, Hannah Elizabeth Blythe, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." Hannah's voice was steady as she repeated her own vows, her green eyes never leaving his face, and when the Archbishop finally pronounced them man and wife, the kiss that sealed their union was witnessed by a household that had learned to love their unlikely Duchess and the baby who had brought them all together. The wedding breakfast that followed was a triumph. Mrs. Hartwell had outdone herself, and even the most skeptical guests had to admit that the new Duchess of Ashford seemed genuinely happy, as did her enigmatic husband, who smiled more in that one day than he had in the previous decade. As evening fell and the guests finally departed, Edward found Hannah in the nursery, rocking a sleeping Grace in the beautiful cradle, still wearing her wedding dress, looking like something out of a fairy tale. "Hello, wife," he said softly, and she looked up with a smile that stopped his heart. "Hello, husband. Come sit with me." Edward settled into the chair beside her, and together they watched Grace sleep, this tiny person who had changed everything. "Are you happy?" he asked, needing to hear her say it. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Hannah said honestly. "There will be challenges, Edward. Society will not accept us easily. There will be those who refuse your invitations, who cut me in public, who whisper that I trapped you. Let them, Edward said, reaching for her hand. They do not matter, Hannah. All that matters is this. You and me and Grace and whatever future we build together. Everything else is just noise. When did you become so wise? Hannah asked with a laugh. When a stubborn nurse appeared at my gate in a storm and refused to accept my excuses for living half a life, Edward replied. You saved me, Hannah, you and Grace. You saved me from becoming a bitter old man alone in an empty house. I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that. We saved each other, Hannah corrected. You gave me a family when I thought I would never have one again. You gave Grace a home and a future. You chose us, Edward, when you could have chosen anything else. That is not something I will ever take for granted. They sat together in the gathering dusk, the new Duke and Duchess of Ashford, with their adopted daughter sleeping peacefully between them, and if anyone had told Edward months ago that this would be his life, he would have laughed at the absurdity of it. A nurse for a wife, an orphan for a daughter, and a heart that had learned to feel again after years of ice. But sitting there in the warm nursery with Hannah's hand in his and Grace's soft breathing filling the silence, Edward knew he had never been more right about anything in his life. This was what he had been missing, this warmth, this connection, this love that had torn down his walls and rebuilt him into someone capable of true happiness. The gossip would continue for months, of course. Lady Pemberton would spread her embellished version of events until the day she died. Society would debate whether the Duke of Ashford had been trapped, or had gone mad, or had simply fallen victim to an adventuress with a convenient orphan. But none of it would touch the life that Edward and Hannah built together in the house that had once been cold and empty. As spring turned to summer and summer to autumn, Ashford House came alive in ways it never had before. Grace grew and thrived, taking her first steps in the same halls where Edward had walked as a lonely boy. Hannah transformed from a terrified nurse into a confident duchess, still bold and unafraid to challenge him, still singing off-key lullabies, still the woman who had demanded that he be more than he was. And Edward, the Ice Duke, the Marble Man, became simply a husband and father who had learned that the greatest courage was not in standing alone, but in opening your heart and letting others in. On quiet evenings, he would sit in the nursery with Hannah and Grace and whatever other children eventually came along, and think about that stormy night in February when everything had changed. He had thought he was doing Hannah a favor by opening his gate. He had thought he was the one with the power, the one making the choice, the one conferring charity on the desperate. But Hannah had been right all along. She had not needed his charity. She had needed his courage, his willingness to step out from behind his walls and risk being fully alive. And in return, she had given him everything. A wife who saw through his masks, a daughter who brought joy into every corner of his house, and a life that was messy and chaotic and absolutely worth living. Some nights, Edward would wake from dreams of his old existence, those cold, ordered days when nothing touched him, and would feel Hannah warm beside him, hear Grace or another child stirring in the nursery, and would thank whatever power had sent a nurse with a baby to his doorstep on a stormy night. Because that was the night Edward Cavendish stopped merely existing and started truly living. The night the Ice Duke melted and the man beneath emerged. The night that everything changed because one stubborn woman refused to take no for an answer, and one lonely man finally found the courage to say yes. Years later, when Grace was grown and had children of her own, she would ask to hear the story of how she came to Ashford House, and Edward and Hannah would sit together and tell her about the storm, the desperation, the impulsive decision that changed 3 lives forever. They would tell her about courage and love and choosing each other when the world said they should not. And Grace, who had grown up surrounded by love in a house full of laughter, would shake her head in wonder at the thought of her father as the Ice Duke, this warm, loving man who had given her everything. But she would understand, because she had been the catalyst, the tiny life that had given 2 lonely people permission to reach for happiness. That was the true miracle of that February night. Not just that a duke had opened his gate to an orphan and a nurse, but that in doing so, he had opened his heart to the possibility of love, of family, of a life lived fully rather than merely endured. And from that single act of courage, 1,000 small miracles had followed, each day a choice to continue being open, being vulnerable, being alive. Edward had once told Hannah that he was tired of living half a life, going through the motions, pretending he did not want more. She had responded by teaching him how to live a whole life, with all its mess and pain and overwhelming joy. It was a lesson he would spend the rest of his days being grateful for, and one he would pass on to every child who grew up in Ashford House, learning that love was not a weakness, but the greatest strength of all, and that opening your heart, while terrifying, was the only way to truly live. The end.